threatening the biggest confrontation between Russia and the West since the Cold War. Moscow approves sending more troops to Ukraine, with the strategic region of Crimea caught up in the crisis. But how will Western powers respond in the face of warnings of war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. Russia has been accused of ignoring international law by sending troops to Ukraine. U.S. President Barack Obama says the move is in clear violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. Russia says it's to protect its citizens. Ukraine has responded by placing its army on full combat alert. Well, there have been months of protests in Ukraine while Russia and Europe compete for its loyalties. Now the focus is turning to the semi-autonomous region of Crimea. We have correspondents in Kiev and Moscow and in the Crimean capital, Simferopol.
In the words of the Ukrainian leadership, we are on the brink of disaster. This is a young administration here in Kiev following the overthrow of former President Yanukovych. They are up against one of the world's most experienced and shrewd politicians, Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader. Ukraine is fighting back as best it can without provoking a further escalation in this crisis. It is mobilizing its reservists, it is putting its full-time troops on the highest state of alert. It has stepped up security at its key installations. They do include nuclear power plants. It desperately wants a diplomatic solution. It is hoping that it can continue to engage its allies in the West to try to convince Mr. Putin to pull back. But perhaps the people in the square, the protesters in the square behind me here in Independence Square, had little idea of the crisis that would follow the overthrow of President Yanukovych.
As far as the Ukrainian government in Kiev is concerned, there is no doubt that the heavily armed forces that have been encircling Ukrainian military installations are Russian. And at the same time, here in the capital, the regional capital, Simferopol, the regional government is feeling guaranteed and protected by those same armed forces, as well as additional paramilitaries. It feels a little bit like the eye of the storm here. There's a certain calm on the streets and also a certain degree of security that many of the local pro-Russian people feel is being provided to them. Regardless of who it is, they feel very much safe now that Russia appears to be giving them protection, and their government here is making decisions on their behalf, but it's looking increasingly like a breakaway region of Ukraine.
Well, it is a waiting game now. Vladimir Putin has shown his hand. He has the mandate from the upper house of parliament to use military force if he so desires in Ukraine. The big question is, will he use that mandate, or does he feel that the threat of military force is enough for Russia to reassert its influence in Ukraine? The phone lines were absolutely humming here with high-level conversations. Vladimir Putin spoke to Barack Obama, he spoke to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he also spoke to the French President Francois Hollande. In all those conversations, he made exactly the same point, that Russia was prepared to protect its citizens, its fellow Russians in Crimea, and also protect the Black Sea Fleet if violence escalates there.
Well, there's plenty to talk about. Let's bring in our panel for today's discussion. In Kiev, we have Valentin Yakushik, a professor of political science at the University of Kiev's Mohila Academy and an advisor to the Ukrainian president. Joining us from the Russian capital, Moscow, is Sergei Markov, spokesman for the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And in our London studios is political risk analyst Alisa Lockwood. Thank you all for being on Inside Story. Before we start our discussion today, let's take a moment to see just how we got to this particular point. Protests began in Ukraine last November after President Yanukovych refused to sign a trade deal with the European Union. Instead, he looked for closer ties with Russia. This prompted mass demonstrations. By early December, pro-EU protesters had occupied City Hall in Kiev. The conflict turned deadly in January when 2 protesters were shot. Negotiations in February saw former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko freed from jail and politicians voting to remove Yanukovych. The president fled Kiev. Then, on Friday, unidentified gunmen appeared outside Crimea's airport, raising accusations of a Russian military intervention. Well, let's now turn to our guest then. Mr. Markov in Moscow, if I can start with you. Russia's upper house of parliament has approved President Putin's request to send Russian forces in Ukraine. Simple question is, why does Russia want to intervene militarily in Ukraine?
Russia don't want to make a military intervention to Ukraine. Russia wants Ukraine to have political solution, which meaning, first of all, the conditions, formation of the coalition government, which can include all parliamentary and political parties. Secondly, disarmament of all paramilitary troops, first of all, neo-Nazis band, which occupy now Kiev and making terror against opposite politicians. Then to have free and fair elections of both parliamentary and presidential, which should be conducted without, it's very important, terror from neo-Nazis band, which is now a leading force in Ukraine. And if
Russia wants a political solution, as you say,
band will make terror.
If Russia wants a political solution, Mr. Markov, as you say, why then put troops on standby?
Because those politicians who now by force illegally grab power in Kiev by restoring of democratically elected legal President Yanukovych, they don't want political solution. They want terror. These people represent only a minority of Ukraine. They know very well they have no chance to win on the free and fair Ukrainian elections.
Okay.
That's why they don't want to have free and fair elections. They want to impose their power by force.
Mr. Markov, let me put this to you. You know, some in the West are accusing Russia of overreacting, that Ukraine has been a very serious foreign policy failure for President Putin, and that this is simply a way for him to get back at Ukraine. What do you respond?
It's not issue of Crimea. It's issue of protecting ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people from terror of minority, military minority which took power in Kiev right now. Okay. Maybe you know, 79% of the Ukrainian internet Russian language. If sociologists ask what kind of application polls people want to use, 83% answer that it's Russian language. Russian language is language of majority.
Okay.
The minority who grab power in Kiev wants to suppress majority and use terror.
Okay,
and Vladimir Putin, as
Mr.
Russian
Markov,
president, under very big pressure of Russian people.
Let's bring in Mr. Yakushik in Kiev to allow him to respond to what you're saying. Mr. Yakushev, Mr. Markov says this is about protecting the Russians in Crimea. What do you respond?
Well, I know Sergei Markov for a long time. He's an excellent political scientist, but he is a bit radical and tends to exaggerate the situation. If talking about the essence of present Ukrainian authorities, who de facto control the center of the country, Kiev, and the west of the country, they are not fascists. They include a strong, radical, national socialist component who are the most powerful military component of the present authorities. But a lot of them are traditional, as we call them, orange Democrats, who become a little bit more radical as during the Orange Revolution, and also naive and democratic pro-Europeans. Right. So in this case, it's not correct how to assess the Ukrainian authorities. Right. What Russia is doing, Russia got frustration because the West managed to get the situation when pro-Western politicians are formally controlling the present Ukrainian authorities. But Russia doesn't take into account that these pro-Westerners will not be for a long time.
Right,
they are about to be overthrown by radical nationalists.
Mr. Yakovich, Mr. Markov does have a point when he says that there are many Russians in Crimea who want closer ties with Russia, who want to be part of Russia.
This is the only Ukrainian territory, Crimea and Sevastopol, which had more loyalty to Russia all the time than to Ukrainian failed state. If Ukraine was more successful, they will be continuing loyalty.
Okay.
But now when they predict a failure, so okay, a lot of them tend to have a kind of Russian aegis, like Russian support, and they started their...
Let's bring in our third guest if we can. We hear your point.
I would say, repeating, in Crimea, they started repeating what was done in Western Ukraine and in Kiev, forming the same kind of organizations. But if in other parts of Ukraine, these were radical nationalists, those were pro-Russian.
Mr. Yakovich, I'll give you more time later to share your viewpoints with us. Let me just bring in Alisa Lockwood in London. Alisa, what do you think Putin's real motivations are here? Is Moscow using the Ukrainian crisis, do you think, as an opportunity to take back Crimea?
I think that for now we have to take what's happening at face value and avoid falling into conspiracy theories about what's going on. Putin requested from the Russian parliament the ability to use force in Ukraine up until the moment when the political situation there is normalized. And that was the actual wording of the statement in question. So there's nothing inherently belligerent about this. However, clearly with the numbers of troops that are being brought in and the blockade of Ukrainian bases and then the response of the Ukrainian interim government, there is a concrete possibility that this will then escalate into something.
Do you think we've reached that dangerous point?
I don't think we're quite there yet. I think it will be interesting to see whether NATO comes out with some kind of quite strict warning to Russia against the use of force and spelling out specific consequences of that.
Okay. Well, let's just take a pause and take a closer look at what's at stake here. And it's Crimea that has been fought over and changed hands many times in its history. It's a largely self-governed part of Ukraine, located on a peninsula that juts out into the Black Sea. Russia annexed Crimea more than 200 years ago. But in 1954, it was transferred to Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1991, Crimea decided in a referendum to join the newly independent Ukraine. But almost 60% of the people there are ethnic Russians. Mr. Markov in Moscow, it was in fact the Russians in Crimea who decided that they wanted to be a part of Ukraine and not Russia in that referendum. So, you know, do you understand that Ukraine can say that this is a region that's theirs, that this is their sovereign land?
I think that people in Crimea and other Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, they support independence of Ukraine because they believe that we will be a democratic country. But now they very much disappointed that ultra-nationalists keep a very important role in the Ukrainian policy all these 20 years of independence. And now if we will have a referendum in Ukraine about where they want to be, in Russia or in Ukraine, I'm sure that 90% will vote that they will want to join Russia. But nevertheless, Russia not going to have such a referendum. Russia absolutely not going to take Crimea from Ukraine. It's this crisis not about this. This crisis about either Russians, Russian-speaking in Ukraine, and the number of Russian-speaking in Ukraine, something about 70%. Either they will have rights and freedoms, or they will be suppressed by neo-Nazis who now part of the Ukrainian government.
Okay. Mr. Yakushik in Kiev, I'll allow you to respond to what Mr. Markov has just said there.
Well, again, I'm coming back to the political forces in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, on a formal basis, in the presidential office and in the parliament, is controlled by relatively liberal people. What is the danger, and danger not only for Russia, for Europe as well, that the next wave of the revolution, when the present team will fail, and it's really doomed to fail, even its leaders are saying that, then the ultranationalists may come to power. And now this is the moment where ultranationalists are incorporated in power enforcement bodies. So that is why Russia is afraid, and the West must be afraid of that. And this is not the subject for ideological warfare. Right. It should be the subject for joint actions on the part of the United States of Europe and Russia. And as to Crimea, Russia, in formal terms, is supporting the local regionalists. And it depends upon the international community what will be the future of regionalists. Now they demand more autonomy. The whole world should help to have more autonomy. Okay. Me, as a citizen of Ukraine, I was always supporting the idea that Crimea must be in Ukraine because it balances the regions with radical nationalism. We need to have Russian-speaking regions which have the influence on Ukrainian politics. And if Crimea leaves, it's only in the interest of the right-wing extreme nationalists.
Okay, Alisa Lockwood, what's your view on this? What do you think Russia's plan is? Is it, as some have suggested, to install Viktor Yanukovych in a Russian-controlled Crimean state?
I think that my colleagues are right in highlighting some of the developments that have been particularly worrying for Russia since this new government came to power, and particularly repealing the law on the use of the Russian language, which would have rung alarm bells in Moscow. So I think that the concern for Russia is really ensuring that the ultranationalists do not have influence within whatever government agreement is achieved.
Okay. Well, there have been considerable tensions in the last few days and talk of war even, but any fight, should it come to it, would hardly be a fair one. Ukraine has less than 100,000 military personnel. That's Army, Air Force and Navy included. Russia almost has 600,000. Ukraine has around 1,100 largely obsolete tanks with another 1,400 in storage. Russia has 2,500 with 18,000 in storage. And Ukraine has a couple of hundred combat-capable aircraft. Russia has almost 1,400. Mr. Yakushik in Kiev, so the Ukrainian government has also put its troops on standby, but, you know, a deployment of the Ukrainian army on the Crimean Peninsula could lead to an unimaginable disaster. I mean, there's a delicate economic situation right now in your country. Isn't it in Kiev's best interest right now to de-escalate this situation and give Russia what it wants? And perhaps that is a stronger voice in negotiations over Ukraine's future economy and Ukraine's future political situation.
Yeah. So the task of de-escalation is the common task for the international community. Ukraine cannot conduct a war with Russia or with anybody else. The government is saying that the previous regime destroyed the army, but not only the previous regime. All the previous Ukrainian regimes were destroying the army and law enforcement organs. So now it's a kind of a patriotic paranoia which will last for some time, and then there will be agreement. That's for sure. And also opposition members of parliament and the local opponents of the present regime, they try to block some military detachments or armies which were supposed to be sent to the south. Today I read it in one blog of a member of parliament. So they do not allow Ukrainian military to move there, and they will not do. And I'm sure that Russia is not going to have any kind of interventions outside Crimea. It's a kind of American policy or British policy in Iraq when they said that if you will move move to that area, we will attack. I suppose that Russian general staff is copying this kind of policy.
Okay.
Russia is overwhelmingly dominating, and they're saying, do not dare to go and
so
send
you think this is just muscle flexing, that Russia is flexing its muscles? Mr. Markov, let me ask you this. Russia may be flexing its muscles, but nonetheless, I mean, it's putting its troops on alert. You know, when you take into account Moscow's long-standing position on Syria's war, for instance, that it only supports a Syrian-led political settlement, it is somewhat puzzling and intriguing that the same Russia today is refusing a political agreement in Ukraine. Anyway, it refused in the past a political agreement in Ukraine between Viktor Yanukovych and 3 of his political opponents. And the same Russia today is threatening intervention in Ukraine. Isn't this a bit contradictory in Russia's foreign policy when they talk about political settlement on the one hand in Syria, and on the other hand in Ukraine they're talking about intervention?
It's a very important question. Very important for understanding this comparison between Ukraine and Syria. Russia every time in all conflicts support moderates and against radicals. If you look at the Syria, where radicals? They are fighting against Assad. They are jihadis who are fighting against Assad. And that's why all ethnic and religious minorities in Syria are supporting Bashar Assad regime. Even they doesn't like him, but nevertheless they afraid of jihadis much more than they afraid of Bashar Assad. Same in Ukraine, where the mostly radical militant nationalists. They are in Kiev junta right now. They are among those who grab power in Kiev. They are neo-Nazis. Why you shouldn't call them as neo-Nazis if they make the law about freedom of Nazist propaganda? If they, and also, what about liberals? This may be some liberals, but they stay under the Nazis red, black flags. They stay nearby with clear neo-Nazis politicians, but mostly moderate people, those who want democracy, those who want free and fair elections, those who don't want suppression. They are in opposition to Kiev junta. And Russia, mostly by military, protecting those moderate people who is under the attack of radicals who want to kill. It's exactly ultra-nationalists and neo-Nazis in Kiev, and this is exactly jihadists in Syria.
Certainly this situation in Ukraine and Crimea has led to rising tensions between the West and Russia. Alisa Lockwood in London, the West is in a very difficult and delicate predicament, isn't it? I mean, we heard Barack Obama say that there will be cost to Russia if there were any military intervention in Ukraine, but realistically, what is the option? What options do countries like the United States or the European Union have if Russia were indeed to intervene in Crimea?
Well, absolutely. The West is in a very difficult position. And it's important to realize that the situations of the EU and the US relative to Russia are actually quite different. I mean, the EU has closer relations with Russia at an economic level, and obviously the question of gas exports is primary among these considerations. And this may explain partly why the EU was initially reluctant to take any strong action and still seems to prefer for the IMF or the US or the UN Security Council to take the lead here.
Do you think if Russia were to invade Ukraine, that the NATO, for instance, would back the Ukrainian government, that NATO would perhaps send troops to back Ukraine? Do you think that could be possible?
Well, as I say, I think NATO would be extremely reluctant to get involved in a conflict directly with Russia and would exhaust any possibility prior to that actually happening. Now, we'll have to wait and see what comes out of the meeting today, but already the moves that are being made, such as France and the UK threatening to not participate in the G8 summit in Russia later this year, these are all very much in the realm of soft diplomacy rather than hard action.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for sharing your viewpoint with us. Thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Story. Sergei Markov in Moscow, Valentin Yakushik in Kiev, and in London, Alisa Lockwood. Thank you all. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can add your voice to this discussion online at Facebook or via Twitter. Thanks for watching Inside Story from me, Foliba Thibault, and the whole team in Doha. Goodbye for now.